Hi everyone and welcome to the Deakin Alumni and Faculty of Arts and Education webinar with Professor Julian Sefton-Green. My name's Farisha Rahman from the Central Alumni Relations team. Today we're broadcasting from the Burwood campus and our webinar topic today is This Changes Everything, What the Digital Means for Education. Professor Julian Sefton-Green joined Deakin in 2017 as Professor of New Media Education. Previously, Professor Sefton-Green held posts in the Department of Media and Communication at the London School of Economics and in the Faculty of Education Research at University of Oslo. Professor Sefton-Green is interested in all things digital from a critical perspective. He has worked and researched at many levels of the education system and on many international projects. For the last 30 years, Professor Sefton-Green has studied classroom interactions, school life, curriculum change, creative media practices, youth community centres, and out-of-school digital cultures. So thank you so much for joining us today, Julian. I'll now pass over to you to begin our presentation today.
Thank you very much, Farisha, and thank you very much for your kind introduction and for the opportunity for me to join you today. I'm pleased to share this chance to talk with you about some of the key issues that I think are very urgent for education systems around the world and for the future of what we're providing for young people. And I'll try and run through some big ideas as clearly and as succinctly as I can. My opening slide, which you can read on screen now, raises the comparison between the work of John Dewey, who is the famous American pragmatist educationalist, who in many ways has been one of the most influential thinkers on modern school systems around the world, particularly with an emphasis on the function of schooling to educate for democracy and of an attention to the role of schools as humane and fair places that produce citizens who are so central to the good functioning of our societies. And my contention really is that there are certain features in the structure of digital technology itself and in the ways in which that technology itself is being introduced and used in our societies that raise a number of very serious and deep-rooted challenges to Dewey's core philosophies. And in that sense, they do seriously threaten and challenge the kind of schooling that we perhaps all went to ourselves, and therefore the kind of schooling that will be on offer to young people in the future. And so this is the kind of very big landscape that I want to address in this presentation. And it's where I think work of education departments, such as the one I'm now at Deakin, need to be addressing and intervening in really urgently at this time. So I want to start with a little bit of a reprise of a project that I was involved in a few years ago, which has been published as a book a couple of years ago. It's called The Class by myself and my colleague Sonia Livingstone. And you can see on the slide there's a URL which underneath the picture of the book itself, which http, and it's connectedyouth.nyu press. And the reason I'm drawing your attention to that is because it's actually an open access book, so you can go away and follow up this presentation, if you're interested with the book itself. And the book was a very interesting experience for myself and Sonia, because what we did was this is when I was living in London, we studied a group of Year 9 students for a whole year. And the class refers to the fact that in England, you're put into a tutor group or form group, and you stay with that group. You don't go to all your lessons with that group. In England, Year 9 kids are 13 to 14 over the year, which is a very interesting age group for a variety of reasons. It's the end of middle schooling. It's the age at which you theoretically or legally even are allowed to have a Facebook account. It's a year when you're going to be choosing some of the subjects that you might want to study in later years. It's a year when you might be beginning to assert your independence and move away from your family. And we spent the whole year immersed in the lives of this class of 13 to 14-year-olds, looking at their lives at home, at school, with their friends, in their families, what their attitudes towards their learning, the activities and sports and after school activities that they got involved in, either informally or formally. And we asked three kind of questions as we spent the year with these group of young people. We wanted to look particularly about what was distinctive about the texture of their lives today and the identities they're forming. And by that, I mean that we were really interested in the ways that we chose a group of people who knew each other in real life. They spent a lot of their days, the time over the days with each other, but they also knew each other virtually, and they were involved in a whole host of online and virtual interactions. So we wanted particularly to look at the ways in which their face-to-face, their real-world interactions were different or similar or continuing or in opposition to their online and virtual interactions. And we wanted to look at the ways in which the kind of person that they were, the kind of people they were becoming was different or similar online and offline. And also we wanted to look at the ways in which they were beginning to understand what being educated means, and also what their families thought being educated meant, and also what their teachers, although that particular study to a lesser extent meant, in what we call the individualized risk society. And by that I mean we're living in a time where rather than following traditional paths in terms of job opportunities or gendered expectations or family roles, as traditional social structures have changed and to some and progressed in some senses, individuals are now more and more responsible for their life chances, and rather than you growing up in a world where your family or your community or your society might take more responsibility for you, the burden now falls on the individual. And in this kind of world with these kinds of large changes, we were interested in what being educated means. What does it promise? What does it mean existentially? In what sense is learning fulfilling or useful or gratifying? Or in what senses do people now think of education simply as a means to get a job, and they're making calculations the whole time how to compete in order to succeed? And thirdly, we looked at the ways that in the everyday texture of life in London, and we studied a community that was very diverse in terms of ethnicity, in terms of race, in terms of affluence. So we studied young people who were quite well off and other young people who came from, who might have been refugees, for example, and were living in social housing. So quite a range of different young people from different kinds of social backgrounds. And that study was interesting in revealing a certain kinds of structural changes to what it means to grow up in London today. So a couple of kind of key features of that, and because it's an ethnography, it's a study that tries to convey its argument through forms of narrative, through forms of story, if you like, and I don't have time in this presentation to kind of rehearse the individual life stories of the people who are the characters, if you like, in that novel or study. So the general kind of findings are very much how young people's lives is split between rather separate social domains. So when they were at school, their families didn't really know what they were doing, and when they were at home, their teachers didn't know what they were doing, and what the young people wanted to do was spend time with their friends so that neither their families nor their teachers knew what they were doing. So the young people were connected virtually, but we also witnessed, and other research bears testimony to this, a huge range of social and interpersonal separation and isolation. And by that I mean that young people's gender or their social class or their ethnicity, as well as life within the family itself, was highly divided and isolated in some respects. The other kind of findings of the study were very much that although we were interested in digital technology and virtual life, the young people in some senses weren't. That technology was for them an everyday utility. It was like electricity or water. It's kind of only interesting when it doesn't work. We paid a great deal of attention to what we called 3 C's. That's connected, competitive, or conservative. And by that we meant that although the young people were connected in all sorts of ways, in some respects, the domains of their families, schools, and young people's lives were highly separated. That the school's capacity to communicate or connect with the home was still mediated by highly formal and structured parent-teacher interactions and things like that. It's competitive in as much as everybody saw education very much in terms of individual accomplishments rather than working collaboratively. And that's as much a response to the changing culture of high-stakes examination and testing that is so prevalent in many education systems around the world. And finally, the last 2 points on the slide point to the ways in which that new technology both was reconfiguring boundaries between home, school and peer cultures, but also not. So there are funny stories in the book, quite funny stories for an academic, of, for example, the way that the young boys, the young men, for example, they were keen game players, and partly they were keen game players because it transpired that they were just at the age where some of them were going out more independently than others, but many young people weren't really being allowed to be on the streets by themselves because parents thought this was unsafe. So the kids would hang out playing games together online. So they'd be in their own bedrooms, but they'd be connected by Skype, playing together. And this was also because, as several parents told us, that the young boys are very nice and very sweet and everything, they're a bit like dogs, that they tended to kind of knock things over and make a mess, so that the young boys weren't terribly welcome socially in each other's houses, so they had to find a way to hang out with each other. And this is part of the ways that online culture could be said to be supporting friendship group and peer bonding. But we also found many stories of positive and negative connections and disconnections between the home and the school, such as the young man from a Turkish background who was a brilliant saz player, which is a kind of musical instrument, but kind of lute, but nobody seemed to know that he was just a disciplined and hard-working musician in school, and the sort of consistent failure of school to kind of take into account the kind of learning and the kind of educational experiences that young people might encounter in their life outside school. So when Sonia and I have given presentations about this book, a lot of teachers and educationalists have said, well, this is all very interesting to know how young people are living their lives, but what does that mean in terms of what we should do in schools? How can we make sense of digital technology in terms of changing education policy or school practice? And one of the things to think of, this kind of question made us think quite deeply, and it also has made us kind of look quite in quite a determined way at the ways in which the digital does change everyday life in a kind of minute and often kind of unimportant way. So, for example, everywhere, recently, for example, I was at a Pilates class, and the instructor there asked what I did, and I said what I did, and then he said, well, oh, how many minutes should I be letting my daughter, who's 10, play on her iPad each day? And this is a sort of example about the ways in which people, in fact, particularly parents, obviously, but many people have a kind of sense of an understanding of the everyday technology and not knowing how to figure that in their everyday life. And so we call this the kind of everyday digital. And it's very difficult not to overestimate, rather, how important this has been in kind of reconfiguring so many aspects of our everyday lives. So when I've talked to live audiences, I often ask people, how many people are in a relationship through a dating website or app or something like that. Because every aspect of personal life now is probably highly mediated through digital technology, not just a question of kind of dating, but the kinds of everyday interactions, texting, being in chat groups, WeChat or WhatsApp and so on. Much of family life is highly conducted through digital mechanisms, parents finding out where children are, children not replying to parents trying to find out where they are, all sorts of social interactions. And we know in terms of the larger civic and political relationships, we know from some of the major changes around the world in 2016 how important digital technology has been to kind of shaping important decision making. And I'm thinking here particularly about the rise of populism in Spain or Greece or America, obviously, and in England with the Brexit vote. But there are also new social practices in terms of consumption, civics, entertainment, learning and knowledge of the world. And this is everything from the growth of driverless cars to which will have an enormous impact on the ways that cities are built, for example, cities currently being built around the car. And obviously, we know about the decline in broadcast television and the growth of kind of subscription entertainment channels, YouTube, and so on. And finally, the kind of way that everybody's work is in some ways being affected by forms of digital technology. And sometimes this is extreme, that people are being laid off or in inverted commas, like being replaced by robots, which doesn't actually really true, but we really happen. But we do know that forms of artificial intelligence, AI, and automation are radically having an effect on workplaces, and it also affects kind of what you do every day in your job. So, for example, I was talking recently with a colleague from Germany who studies social work, and they've been introducing in Cologne, in the area where she was working, forms of risk assessment that social workers now conduct when taking children into care. So this is a form of personal interaction that is highly judgment-driven, extremely sensitive, and obviously very important. And yet artificial intelligence algorithms are now being invented and deployed in order to guide the kinds of decisions that we would normally and usually think should be the judgments made by human beings. And we also know that in forms of medicine, AI is really important. So the point I'm trying to make here is that digital technology is having an enormous effect on the ways in which what we expect work to be about is itself being changed. To generalize from these everyday technologies, it takes us to a series of kind of important structural changes about the way that our worlds are organized, the way that our societies kind of function, and especially the ways that economies create growth. So as I've already suggested, we know that digital technology is a key driver of economic growth and change. And I've already mentioned automation and AI, artificial intelligence, but I could equally well mention financialization, so the way in which the trading in stocks and shares and the commercial markets around the world are entirely kind of mediated through forms of digital connectivity and datafication. And we also know, as I've already suggested, that many traditional economic activities are being completely restructured, particularly with the growth of data-driven platforms. I'll talk a little bit more in the next slide. But basically, the forms of economic and social life that we might have grown up with are being radically transformed, and of course are now far more interconnected at a kind of global and a world level, as not only just in terms of consolidation of global companies, but also through the ways that data is derived from kind of global markets. Thirdly, I think the digital has the means to create a new kind of nation or state through forms of knowledge, personalization, citizenship, and surveillance. And by that, I mean that many of our interactions with government in Australia through something like MyGov, that many of your interactions with forms of government itself are now highly digitally driven, and are your experience of interacting with the state is a kind of digital one in some respects, and also through forms of personalization. So one of the things that has received quite a lot of press recently is China's social credit system, which is a form of using digital technologies to kind of track and log and then evaluate all its citizens' social activities in order to kind of give some social credit rating, which is a particular kind of extreme of forms of kind of knowledge about citizens that's growing in the world. Fourthly, we can see that digital is intertwined with the kind of growth of the consolidation of wealth in hands of fewer and fewer people, and the growth of a few kind of enormously dominant kind of world companies. And that has enormous consequences for the authority of the nation state. And finally, the kind of impact of all of these features has enormous kind of consequences for our understandings of identities and rights. And I'm particularly thinking here about the ways in which people's understandings about what is private, about what could be known by other people, what should be known by the state. So stories about whether employers trawl your social media profile when you apply for a job, questions about whether you how much people are aware of how many of their digital interactions are being monitored and turned into data for other people's kind of profit. I've got here a brief kind of summary of some of the huge platforms that are now kind of dominating the world. I think I'm not going to go through them all in great detail because I think some of you will know about some of these platforms. I would draw your attention to the sort of difference in kind of function. So that we're used to kinds of forms of platform around advertising and Facebook, and particularly the ways in which Google and Facebook derive their profit through turning data into their capacity to monetize data, to sell data onto advertisers, has enormous consequences. And then in particular, we know that the recent discussion around the company Cambridge Analytica and its possible role in both the rise of Donald Trump and the Brexit vote, for example, raise very, very deep questions about the ways in which the new digital media are themselves exerting an extraordinarily strong, or possibly exerting an extraordinarily strong influence on the choices that people make, the votes that people have, and the way that political decisions then get made. But I'd also draw your attention to what I call state platforms. So I've mentioned the social credit system, SCS, the Chinese one, but also MyGov in Australia. I think it's called just gov.uk in the UK, or Centrelink. And these kinds of platforms, nowadays, most people's everyday interactions in virtually everything that they do, from hanging out with their friends, to being with their family, to buying things, to being at work. What else do we do? Entertainment. All of these kinds of traditional spheres of activities are now highly mediated and controlled by digital platforms. And of course, this leads to a huge production of data. And there are now these ugly words around like datafication or datavalence or surveillance capitalism, none of which are terribly good phrases, but all of which are trying to sum up the ways that the digital has radically transformed our experiences into forms of data, which then can then be controlled or known about or sold and traded in ways that are completely new. So why have I talked about all of this when I started talking about the lives of young people and their interactions every day at school and at home? Well, firstly, because I wanted to draw attention to the ways that, although we tend to focus on what I called everyday technology, it's important to understand how behind the everyday technology there are these extraordinary reconfigurations and restructuring of the relationships between the individual, the state, and the market. And that's kind of pretty important to get a handle on when considering what the purpose is of education. And secondly, because I think this move to digital societies is part of radical changes affecting the purposes of education in our society. So I'd argue that whereas traditionally schools offered social mobility, it offered children the opportunity to learn in order to inherit, in order to enter into forms of life that in some ways were trumped their parents in terms of economic well-being. I think that's no longer as true because of the ways in which the opportunities for employment in many countries in the West are now being transformed by digital restructuring of the world economy. I think traditional forms of accreditation have been dealt a serious blow, so people's attitude towards learning and education is not the same as it used to be. And we know, you'll know, I don't know who you all are, of course, but if you're at school or you work in a school or you have children in a school, you'll know how the actual teaching and learning itself and changes in institutional arrangements mean that your relationship with school and what you know about your kids' learning has changed. And all of this, I want to suggest, leads to a need to reconceptualize the purposes of education. And this is where I want to kind of return to the point where I started with referencing the work of John Dewey and the kind of dominant views of education that we have. So I'm going to take you on a very slight detour now, and I just want to sort of quickly rehearse what I think of as 5 main explanations of the purposes of education. Now, this is a really huge topic, and all of you out there are likely to have some point of disagreement with me, which would be great. But I think in general, our societies tend to have 5 main views about education. And the first of these, and this is the one that is most popular at the moment and has been most popular in cultural terms for the last 20 or 30 years, is what I've called education in the service of the economy. And that is the idea that the purpose of education is to prepare young people for work that will produce young people of different abilities in order to do different kinds of jobs. And that the point of education is in terms of skill development and a version of developing ourselves that is associated with the idea of human capital. And I'm not making any judgments about these different versions of education. I'm saying that they are simply used as justifications for why we have schools and what education can achieve. And in most countries around the world, most politicians tend to emphasize this particular view of the purposes of education. But secondly, as I've got there, we also are obsessed with the ways in which education is there to maintain cultural and moral national values. That most education systems grew up with the birth of their own nation states, and we very much want young people in our own societies, wherever they are, to learn about the society in which they are living and to kind of adopt the main kind of sense of values and principles of that particular nation. And I'm thinking of times in an education system where education has been much more explicitly patriotic and things like that. The third argument is around this is probably a little bit academic, the socialization of political and civic subjectification. And what I'm trying to talk about there is the ways that, broadly speaking, we have schools so that young people learn to obey the law and to vote. In other words, we need, like Dewey, I'm being unfair to Dewey, we need schools to develop citizens who will play their part in perpetuating the kind of political system in which they live. So that's a key kind of function of education, that the young people who go to school know how to behave when they're kind of grown up in terms of perpetuating the same kind of social organization. The fourth argument there is around what I call variants of individual personhood. And that's about the ways in which we're interested in, all societies tend to have views about what young people are like. So in Finland, for example, there's a great emphasis on play. Other countries will emphasize children's innate curiosity. We tend to have an assumption about how young people develop and what's kind of good for them. So some countries want to discipline children more than others. Some want to make them more free than others. This also affects our general attitudes towards schooling. And finally, there's an argument about schooling in terms of promoting particular kinds of reasoning in society. So very popular, well-known controversial examples, for example, around the ways in which evolution is definitely a sensitive topic to be taught in certain states in the US, whereas in other countries it would be considered ludicrous that such a principle wouldn't be openly taught and understood. The point I'm trying to make here is that all forms of education tend to give value to particular kinds of ways of thinking, which is part of the general values of their society. Now, why have I gone through these general explanations for the purposes of education? Well, I've done this in order to show how the digital is digging away at any one of these inherited principles. So whilst we, and I take we to be the people who are out there listening to this, and myself grew up with variants of those general purposes influencing the education that we had and that we might believe in, I think we can now see how forms of the digital are eating away and challenging all of those general principles in different kinds of ways. So in terms of education in the service of the economy argument, you can now see how digital literacy is kind of central to arguments about digital skills, but also about for example, the balance about whether all children should be taught to code and therefore have knowledge, access to knowledge, which otherwise will become the property of an elite. In terms of the maintenance of cultural and moral national values, I've already mentioned Trump and the growth of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, Brexit, and so on, and the whole debate about the ways in which moral, cultural and national values are now susceptible to being mediated by particular technological filter bubbles. And this is the third point as well, about the ways in which I said about young people being educated to obey the law and vote. Now the question is how you find out information about the world you're living in order to make a decision, because if we're now living in a world where there isn't mass media and people get their news from Facebook, it has profound consequences. And then in terms of individual personhood argument, there's one of the huge ways in which digital technology has been taken up in the popular press, for example, is often stories about the destruction of childhood. So around young people's incapacity or incapacity to pay attention, growth of attention disorders, the growth of mental health anxieties that are presumed to be mediated by technology. In other words, what I'm trying to get at here is that our norms of what a healthy, normal child is are being challenged by the ways that the everyday digital eats into everyday life. So my main argument and the main purpose of this talk is to raise the case that the digital, in a sense, demands a new purpose for education. That it's not satisfactory just to think of the digital in terms of making teaching more efficient or making schools more effective, but the digital itself is challenging our expectations about personal identity, about family life, about job opportunities, about the ways we make sense of the world, about what the point of being a citizen is. And so therefore, the real kind of argument I want to put out there, and what I think education departments in universities should be going on about, is the extraordinary ways in which the digital demands that we consider the purposes of education in radically different ways to what's currently going on. And that's a big theoretical and conceptual challenge. And I'm just going to finish in the final few minutes by going through one example of a small project we carried out here at Deakin last year as a tiny contribution to this larger ambition. And this basically is a project that we ran for teachers. And this is a screenshot of a website which you can have a look at. And I think it's small writing, but at the top there, the website is called Researching the Everyday Digital. And what that project and this website recounts is work we did with some teachers here in the greater, I don't know, I'm not allowed to call it the Melbourne area, right in the Geelong area, I think I'm allowed to say. What we did with those teachers is we got them to talk about some of the consequences of both everyday digital technology and some of these larger structural, economic and political challenges. And then rather than giving them research about the ways in which young people's lives were changing, we tried to get the teachers to learn how to research their students' everyday uses of technology. Because one of the things that's going on with the digital is there's an enormous amount of misinformation, misunderstanding, and miscommunication about the digital and young people themselves. So what we tried to do here was get teachers to learn to look at how their students' lives were being changed by the digital, and then to get the teachers to think about the consequences of those changes, both for the ways that they ran their own classes, so for curriculum change, but also for the ways that the schools themselves might communicate and interact with families and the community. Some schools, for example, in Australia, run BYOD, bring your own device. And in those kinds of environments, schools are now playing a very different role in relationship to families' attitudes to and consumption of technology. And we wanted to get teachers to think about some of this, but rather than, not from the point of view of teachers knowing the answers, but rather to get teachers engaged in the kind of arguments that I've just run through with you all, to get teachers to learn from the actual social changes that are occurring in the everyday lives of their students. Because one of the key features of research in this area is that there's an enormous amount of change and uncertainty and confusion about what young people are actually up to. And it was very interesting to give the teachers the opportunity to meet and talk and then to develop research projects that they could carry out in their own schools, in their own communities, and then to get them to reflect on that knowledge and see how they could turn that knowledge into ways of changing what they did in the classroom, or how the school sent out its newsletters and things like that. And on the website, there are basically videos of teachers talking about the research that they conducted and what they think their findings might tell them would be useful for changes in their schools. So these are the questions that I would encourage you, if you get a chance to visit the website, to have a look at the teachers and see what the teachers thought was interesting, and why did the teachers focus on one topic rather than another. And given that I've just run through what I think are some of the philosophical, political, practical, and conceptual challenges posed by digital technology, why do teachers focus on some of those aspects and not others? In what ways do their responsibility as teachers perhaps hinder or support their capacities as citizens to be able to kind of make changes to the work they do in schools? So that's just a small example of the kind of projects that I'd like to see going on as ways of engaging community and teachers and young people in what I think is a kind of substantial challenge facing schools and young people and societies in generally. And this final kind of slide tries to kind of sum up in a rather abstract way some of the huge scale of these challenges. And so it's all very well thinking on a huge canvas what the big ideas are, but it seems to me that the important challenge for people working in education is to be able to design and implement small-scale local projects where we can kind of work with people in very different communities, because it's not possible always to generalize about the impact of digital technology equally across all aspects of society in order to bring about the kind of acceptance that we need to take responsibility for the digital and build it into our curriculum and build it into our policy and make our politicians face up to the responsibilities that the digital puts upon them in the ways that it is transforming our societies and opportunities for young people today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Julian. What a very informative presentation that was. We'll now jump over to our questions, thoughts and discussion time. So I'll leave a few minutes now for you to type your questions in now. Okay, our first question is from Marie. As it is a global and not national issue, the technological disruption is enormous over the following decades, and the young need skills in flexibility, adaptability, critical thinking, and analysis to survive, grow, and develop, which sadly are not being addressed. I think that's more of a comment.
I think so, yeah. I'll just make one point off that. I'm not trying to misread Maria's intentions, but I think one of the points in the way you phrased your comment there, Maria, is the difference between, you're right to point to the global and international nature of this, but actually, of course, different parts of the country and all countries are left behind or ahead in these kinds of debates in very different kinds of ways. And one of the things that governments tend to do is imagine that the effect of the digital is kind of equal for everybody, and it just isn't. And that needs to be one of the reasons we were so keen to work with teachers in a particular area, was to show how the opportunities are very different for different communities.
Thank you. Our next question from Anna. Where do you see the school's role in supporting parents with their children's digital habits at home?
So in some ways, in Australia, I don't know where Anna is based. Does it say, or we don't know? Okay, it doesn't really matter. But assuming she's Australian, in some ways, in some countries, we've been very cautious, and properly so in some respects, in demarcating responsibilities boundaries between schools and families. So teachers aren't encouraged to be online with their students, and students indeed aren't encouraged to be online with their teachers, and parents would find it awkward in some circumstances if they were, and there are all sorts of issues of risk involved in this. But what that's meant at the moment is we tend to have an unfortunate boundary between kind of what happens in school is the teacher's responsibility and what happens at home is the parent's responsibility, which means that each side tends to have the view it needs to tell the other side what to do, which isn't always very productive. I think one of the interesting things about the project I talked about, the Everyday Digital, the research in the Everyday Digital project, was that it got teachers talking to the children about what they were doing, and that helped them raise the kinds of questions that they wanted to raise with parents. So I think one of the key issues is to find families, however nice schools are, families tend to be a bit subservient towards schools and teachers tend to be a bit bossy towards parents. So we need to find other ways to open out this kind of relationship. And in some ways, the digital is just another phase of an ongoing problem about the way that schools and families often don't communicate very well, which isn't a very good practical answer to your question, Anna. I accept that. But I do think that if teachers were less kind of we need a more open way of sharing digital habits between school and home so that there can be a more proper discussion rather than you should own a more prescriptive kind of legalistic approach.
Sure, thank you, Julian. Our next question from Josie. Is there any national summit that would address digital impact in everyday lives for students?
Gosh.
There's another comment from Josie. I'm thinking of the Gonski report and the government's receptiveness to take on board recommendations that are given to them when issues are addressed in this forum.
So I don't really know the answer to this because, as you can tell from my accent and my description, I've only been in Australia for a year. So I literally don't know the formal answer to that. And I think that's a great question. And I'm always surprised about the ways I haven't come across very good examples where governments who are genuinely interested in these kinds of questions can find forums to sit down with people to discuss these kinds of questions. But I think that would be fantastic. I mean, most discussions around the digital and education tend to be not where the challenges of the digital are challenging education. So I shall stop talking because I don't know the answer, as I just said.
That's okay, thank you. So you can follow the Deakin Alumni social media channels on Facebook and LinkedIn to keep up to date with our various alumni events and webinars. And a very big thank you to everyone who's joined us from all around Australia. A recording will be available in the next few weeks. And if you've got any feedback, please don't hesitate to write to us to deakinalumni@deakin.edu.au. Have a great day, everyone, and thanks for tuning in.